Hi, it's Armaan, and welcome to Chapter 39 of the American Pageant, The Resurgence of Conservatism. This chapter covers the time span of 1980 to 1992 and focuses on the rise of Ronald Reagan and his conservative ideals, which led to major changes in the government of the United States, ending with the introduction of George H.W. Bush to the presidential office. So, let's get started. Starting off with the 1980 election, during this time there was a conservative movement called the New Right, which took a conservative stance on issues such as abortion, homosexuality, and feminism. Reagan sided with the New Right on most of these social issues. This movement was opposed to a large federal government, and in similar fashion, one of Reagan's largest points was that he argued for the common man versus the big government. He disliked federal intervention in local affairs, favoritism for minorities, and the elitism of bureaucrats, and his aim was to win over the working-class white voters who supported the Democratic Party, and he advocated that the Democratic Party equated to big government and acted as a tool for minorities. Current incumbent President Jimmy Carter's turmoils regarding uncontrollable double-digit inflation angered citizens, presenting the image that he was incapable of managing the nation's affairs. Carter's ruling divided the Democratic Party, starting movements such as the ABC, which stood for Anybody But Carter movement. As a result, further liberal Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts was favored by some Democrats. Carter and Kennedy won against each other in primaries, but Carter eventually won due to the conservative nature of the country at the time, as well as controversies over a 1969 car crash involving Kennedy's car falling off a bridge and the death of a drowned young woman assistant. During his campaign, Reagan attacked Carter's performance in various areas such as foreign policy, rising inflation, and high interest rates. He even used the concept of associating Democrats with big government against him. Carter retaliated, stating that Reagan was too trigger-happy and could enter the country into a nuclear war. But come election day, Reagan and the Republicans reigned victorious with 51% of the popular vote, with Reagan receiving 489 electoral votes. And the Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time in 26 years. Right after the inauguration of Reagan on January 20th, 1981, a major event takes place in that the Iran hostage crisis comes to an end, as 52 captives who were stuck at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, were set free. This crisis occurred because militant Iranian students were outraged that the U.S. government allowed the ousted Shah of Iran to go to New York City for medical treatment. With Reagan in office, the economic approach of Reaganomics began, which focused on smaller government, less bureaucracy, and freer markets. Reagan had common cause with longtime ally Great Britain and leader Margaret Thatcher, who became the first female prime minister in 1979. Thatcher wanted to reduce power of labor unions and government involvement in business, which were two of Reagan's primary goals. A quote from the textbook summarizes Reaganomics perfectly, in which it states, quote, "Free markets made free peoples, and that shrinking government made keeping their nation safer from communism," end quote. Now for reference, before Reagan's presidency from the 1960s onwards, federal spending rose from 18% to 23%, and during this time, spending shifted from defense to entitlement programs, including Social Security and Medicare. In fact, in 1973, the budgets of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare surpassed the budget of the Department of Defense, and eventually all these Great Society programs experienced a counterattack in Proposition 13, which was a staged tax revolt by Californians in 1978, which slashed property taxes and forced painful cuts in government services. In terms of Reagan's presidency, he proposed a new federal budget which had a cut of $35 billion in programs such as food stamps and federally funded job training programs. And in order to gain support, there were certain Southern conservative Democrats called ball weevils who were wooed to agreeing with Reagan on policy in the House and abandoned their own party's leadership to follow the president. Additionally, in March 1981, a failed assassination attempt brought a wave of sympathy and more support for Reagan as president, even though many didn't agree with his ideas. Also in 1981 came the concept of supply-side economics, which was a combination of budgetary discipline and tax reduction, which would stimulate new investment, boost productivity, foster dramatic economic growth, and reduce the federal deficit. But in 1982, a huge recession occurs, and unemployment reaches 11%. Businesses were falling and bank failures shook the country's financial system. The automobile industry, which was once the best in America, performed the worst in its history. And Democrats complained that the recession was caused by Reagan's budget cuts, which attacked the poor and handicapped and benefited the well-off. But it was also anti-inflationary type money policies passed by the Federal Reserve Board in 1979 under Jimmy Carter's presidency, which contributed to this recession as well. Economic recovery from the recession started in 1984, but the 1980s economy was still not stable. For the first time in the 20th century, income gaps increased. The poor got poorer, the rich got richer, and the middle class stayed relatively the same. Also emerging during this time were yuppies, also known as young urban professionals, which made up 1.5 million people of the population. They were an economic group which focused their lives around materialism and wealth, hence their Rolexes and BMWs. Also, in terms of the federal budget deficits, in 1982 the federal budget deficit was $100 billion, and it was going out of bounds $200 billion in every year afterwards. And this government money borrowing led to high interest rates, and these high interest rates led to the value of the dollar to increase massively. And the trade deficit in 1987 became $152 billion, and America became the most borrower during the 1980s. In terms of foreign affairs, Reagan was extremely tough towards the Soviet Union throughout his presidency, and he stated that Soviets were prepared to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat in pursuit of their goals of world conquest. However, he was open to negotiations with the Soviets from a higher position of power, so his plan was to increase the size of the US military and threaten Soviets with an artillery race. So the Strategic Defense Initiative of March 1983 was basically a missile defense system which could fire laser beams from battle stations and hit cross-continental missiles. And overall, relations with the USSR remained unstable due to the debts of three oligarchs from 1982 to 1985 and imposing of economic sanctions. Now, in regards to other foreign affairs, U.S. relations with Israel became poor as a result of Israel allowing new settlements to be made in the West Bank, and in June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in order to suppress guerrilla bases of Palestinians. So in 1983, Reagan sends U.S. troops to Lebanon in order to maintain peace. However, a suicide bomber crashed an explosive-containing truck into a U.S. Marine barrack on October 23, 1983, which ended up killing 200-plus Marines. And despite this tragedy, Reagan did not suffer politically from this at all. Elsewhere, Sandinistas, or leftist revolutionaries in Nicaragua, took control of the country in 1979, and they were an anti-American group even though Carter tried to establish good relations with them. Reagan, on the other hand, accused them as being a base for Soviet and Cuban militaries. So American quote-unquote military advisors were sent for the presence of a pro-American government, and aid was sent to the Contras, who were anti-American government opposers. And America also elsewhere displayed dominance in the Caribbean, with the American invasion of Grenada in October 1983, when the U.S. took control of the island after a coup killed the Prime Minister and Marxist power took over. The 1984 election comes around and Reagan wins the second presidential term election against Democrat Walter Mondale. Mondale's vice presidential candidate was Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro of New York, and she was the first woman on a major party presidential setting. But Mondale lost because of his work as vice president under Carter, and Reagan won with 525 to 13 electoral votes and 52 million to 36 million popular votes, and foreign policy was Reagan's focus for his second term. Going back to the Soviet Union, a new Soviet leader had come in charge, and he was Mikhail Gorbachev in March 1985, and he had two methods that he wanted to impose. One was glasnost, which stands for openness, and that was to aim to ventilate the secret repressive stuffiness of Soviet society by introducing free speech and a measure of political liberty. The other one was called perestroika, or also known as restructuring, which is intended to revive the moribund Soviet economy by adopting many of the free market practices, for example profit and ending subsidized prices. And both of these methods required the Soviet Union to reduce the size of its military and focus on the economy, ending the Cold War. In April 1985, the USSR announces that it would not bring out its INF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, towards Western Europe. Following, in December 1987, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is signed, banning those missiles from Europe entirely. So in May 1988, the Cold War is officially ended. Going back to 1985, American diplomats had a secret arrangement of sales of arms with Iran. Iran thus helped free one current hostage, and money given by Iran was sent to Contras in Nicaragua. However, this disobeyed Congress's ban on sending aid to rebels. So in November 1986, these findings were reported, and Reagan claimed he did not know this was occurring. And this situation cast a bad light on Reagan's foreign policy achievements, but despite this, he remained one of the most favored presidents in American history. Reagan's presidency put America $2 trillion more in debt, which was more than the previous presidents combined. He achieved his goal of the containment of welfare. However, a negative arose as well, as the trend of distribution of income reversed as a result of his presidency. It went from $33,500 in 1989 to a lower $31,000 in 1993. There also came a rise in religious and political groups during the 1980s, such as the Moral Majority, which were a group of conservative evangelical Christians, which was made in 1979 by Reverend Jerry Falwell. They opposed sexual permissiveness, abortion, feminism, and gay rights. And basically, previous personal matters, including gender roles, became political basis for parties during this time. The Moral Majority called themselves Christian and pro-life voters, and many blocked abortion clinic entrances, but they fell apart in the later part of the decade. During his presidency, Reagan put in almost majority sitting judges and appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. An important one to note is Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to be in the Supreme Court. Reagan's presidency conflicted the ideas of affirmative action and abortion. For example, 1989's case of Ward's Cove Packing versus Antonia and Martin versus Wilkes, which made it so that it was harder to prove a workplace conducted racial discrimination. And also Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, which stated that states could restrict access to abortion as long as they did not place an undue burden on the woman. Democrats regained Senate control in November 1986, and thus they blocked the conservative nominee for the Supreme Court in 1987. A significant economic event which took place during this time was also Black Monday, which occurred on October 19, 1987, and that was when the leading stock market index went down 508 points, which was the largest crash in a single day in history, represented by this graph on the screen. As Reagan's second term came to an end, the 1988 presidential election began, and the two opponents were Michael Dukakis, who was the Democratic nominee, versus George H.W. Bush, who was the Republican nominee, and the former vice president of Reagan. Bush ended up winning with 47 million popular votes to 41 million votes, and 426 electoral votes to 111 electoral votes, and he was inaugurated on January 1989. The year 1989 is regarded as the season of democracy, and hundreds and thousands of pro-democracy protesters protested in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. In June, however, the pro-democracy movement was crushed, and people were literally run over by tanks and machine guns. There were large changes taking place in Eastern Europe, such as the Solidarity movement in Poland and communist regimes collapsing with speed in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, also the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. In December 1991, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet president, and the Soviet Union splits into the Commonwealth of Independent States, all who supported democratic reforms and a free market economy. However, the USSR's dissolvement caused some questions to occur about which country would regard arms relations with the United States. Also, ethnic hatred and war spread across communist countries such as Yugoslavia and Russia, with minorities wanting independence. At the start of the decade, on August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his armies to invade oil-rich country Kuwait. His goal was to, if he could take control of Kuwait's oil, then he would be able to control the Arab region and destroy the enemy, which was Israel. The United Nations gave Hussein an ultimatum of January 15, 1991 to remove his troops from Kuwait or else force would be used, and Iraq used forces such as Scud bombs. Operation Desert Storm, which lasted for 4 days, ultimately took place with UN forces attacking deep into Iraq, preventing Iraqi forces from retreating and resupplying, and on February 27, 1991, Hussein declared a ceasefire. Important legislation was passed in 1990 with the Americans with Disability Act, which removed discrimination against Americans with mental or physical disabilities, which accounted for 43 million people. In terms of social issues, Bush in 1990 challenged college scholarships targeted towards racial minorities, and more. In 1991, Bush nominated African-American conservative Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, and during this nomination process, Anita Hill, professor of the University of Oklahoma, accused Thomas of sexual assault days before the Senate vote. The Senate vote ended 7-7 with a tie, making it go to the Senate, where 52-48 majority ruled in favor of Thomas being elected to the Supreme Court. And many women were now growing agitated over Bush's stand on women's rights and abortion. Lastly in this chapter, the economy under Bush was struggling. In 1992, the unemployment rate was 7+%, and in California specifically, it was 10+%. The federal budget deficit was $250 billion a year, and in 1990, there was a budget increase, bringing in $133 billion in new taxes. Bush said in his 1988 presidential campaign that he would not impose any new taxes, but he was now going back on his word. Thank you for watching my video explainer project on chapter 39, and I hope it was helpful.